So one of my friends suggested that I do a read aloud and just sort of make it a general public thing. And I said, okay. I love doing read alouds, and I love in particular to read funny books that have lots of different voices. I used to be a classroom teacher, and that was one of my favorite times of the day was to do the read aloud. We were always reading some sort of book in my classroom. So today I'm going to start a read aloud, and I'm going to try to upload some chapters regularly. And so the read aloud I'm choosing to do is a book that is one of my absolute favorites. It's called A Tale Dark and Grimm, and it is by Adam Gidwitz. And not only is he a hilarious author, but he is a hilarious person. I got a chance to meet him at a library conference, and he is amazing and funny. And I actually, the conference I got to attend, I got to sit right next to him, and I fangirled the entire time. I had a hard time actually making complete sentences in front of my favorite author. So he is a lot of fun in person as well in story. So without further ado, A Tale Dark and Grimm. Now I have to make sure that you understand that this is a mashup of Grimm's fairy tales. He's got a whole bunch of different characters. They all kind of clump together, and he takes other fairy tales as well, not just Grimm's, but other fairy tales, and puts them together. They run into different characters and different types of stories. And so in case you'd like to do some further research, you've got that. So now, A Tale Dark and Grimm. Once upon a time, fairy tales were awesome. I know. You don't believe me. I don't blame you. A little while ago, I wouldn't have believed it myself. Little girls in red caps skipping through the forest. Awesome? I don't think so. But then I started to read them. The real Grimm ones. Very few little girls in red caps in those. Well, there's one. And she gets eaten. Okay, you're probably saying, if fairy tales are awesome, why are all the ones I've heard so unbelievably mind-numbingly boring? You know how it is with stories. Someone tells a story, then somebody repeats it and it changes. Someone else repeats it and it changes again. Then someone's telling it to their kid and taking out all the scary, bloody scenes. In other words, the awesome parts. And the next thing you know, the story's about an adorable little girl in a red cap skipping through the forest to take cookies to her granny. And you're so bored you've passed out on the floor. The real Grimm stories are not like that. Take Hansel and Gretel, for example. Two greedy little children try to eat a witch's house, so she decides to cook and eat them instead, which is fair, it seems to me. But before she can follow through on her perfectly reasonable plan, they lock her in an oven and bake her to death, which is pretty cool, you have to admit. But maybe it's not awesome. Except here's the thing. That's not the real story of Hansel and Gretel. You see, there is another story in Grimm's fairy tales. A story that winds all throughout that moldy, mysterious tome. Like a trail of breadcrumbs winding through a forest. And it appears in tales you may have never heard, like Faithful Johannes and Brother and Sister. And in some that you have, Hansel and Gretel, for instance. It is the story of two children, a girl named Gretel and a boy named Hansel, traveling through a magical and terrifying world. It is the story of two children striving and failing, and then not failing. It is the story of two children finding out the meanings of things. Before I go on, a word of warning. Grimm's stories, the ones that weren't changed for little kids, are violent and bloody. And what you're going to hear now, the one true tale in the tales of Grimm, is as violent and bloody as you can imagine. Really. So if such things bother you, we should probably stop right now. You see, the land of Grimm can be a harrowing place. But it is worth exploring. For in life, it is the darkest zones one finds the brightest beauty and the most luminous wisdom. and of course, the most blood. And now begins the book. Faithful Johannes. Now, I have heard this pronounced several different ways. Johannes, Johan. I don't know how to say it. So Johannes is what we're going with. I also want to point out that in our book, there's the regular font that you will see there, and then the narrator font, which is bold. And so I will do my best to differentiate between. Once upon a time, in a kingdom called Grimm, an old king lay on his deathbed. He was Hansel and Gretel's grandfather. But he didn't know that, for neither Hansel nor Gretel has been born yet. Now hold on a minute. I know what you're thinking. I am well aware that nobody wants to hear a story that happens before the main characters show up. Stories like that are boring because they all end exactly the same way, with the main characters showing up. But don't worry. This story is like no other story you've heard. You see, Hansel and Gretel don't just show up at the end of this story. They show up. Then they get their heads cut off. I just thought you'd like to know. The old king knew he was soon to pass from this world, and so he called for his oldest and most faithful servant. The servant's name was Johannes. But he had served the king's father, and his father's father, and his father's father's father, so loyally that all called him Faithful Johannes. Johannes tottered on his bowed legs, heaving his crooked back, step by step, leering with his one good eye. His long nose sniffed at the air, his mouth puckered around two rotten teeth. But despite his grotesque appearance, when he came within view, the old king smiled and said, "Ah, Johannes," and drew him near. The king's voice was weak as he said, "I am soon to die, but before I go, you must promise me two things. First, promise that you will be as faithful to my young son as you have been to me." Without hesitation, Johannes promised. The old king went on, "Second, promise that you will show him his entire inheritance, the castle, the treasures, all this fine land, except for one room. Do not show him the room with the portrait of the golden princess, for if he sees the portrait, he will fall madly in love with her, and I fear it will cost him his life." The king gripped Johannes's hand. "Promise me." Again, Johannes promised. And then the wrinkles of worry left the king's brow, and he closed his eyes and breathed his last. Soon the prince was crowned as the new king. He was celebrated with parades and toasts and feasts all throughout the kingdom. And when the revelry finally abated, Johannes sat him down for a talk. First, Johannes described to him all the responsibilities of the throne. The young king tried to not fall asleep. Then he explained that the old king had asked him to show the young king his entire inheritance, the castle, the treasures, all this fine land. At the word treasures, the young king's face lit up. Not that he was greedy. It was just that he found the idea of treasures exciting. Finally, Johannes tried to explain his own role to the young king. "I have served your father and your father's father and your father's father's father before that," Johannes said. The young king started calculating on his fingers how that was even possible. But before he could get very far, Johannes had moved on. "They call me Faithful Johannes because I have devoted my life to the kings of Grimm, to helping them, to advising them, to understanding them." "Understanding them?" the young king asked. "No, understanding them. In the ancient sense of the word, standing beneath them, supporting them, bearing their troubles and their pains on my shoulders." The young king thought about this. "So you will understand me too?" he asked. "I will. No matter what. Under any circumstances. That is what being faithful means." "Well, understand that I'm tired of this and would like to see the treasures now." And the young king stood up. Faithful Johannes shook his head and sighed. They began exploring every inch of the castle, the treasure crypts, the towers, every single room, that is, save one. One room remained locked, no matter how many times they passed it. Well, The young king was no fool. He noticed this, and so he asked, "Why is it, Johannes, that you show me every room in the palace, but never this one?" Johannes squinted his one good eye and curled up his puckered two-toothed mouth, and then he said, "Your father asked me not to show you that room, your highness. He feared it might cost you your life." I'm sorry, I need to stop for a moment. I don't know what you're thinking right now, but when I first heard this part of the story, I thought, what is he, crazy? Maybe you know something about young people, and maybe you don't. I, having been one myself, once upon a time, I know a few things about them. One thing I know is that if you don't want one to do something, for example, go into a room where there's a portrait of an unbearably beautiful princess, saying it might cost you your life, is about the worst thing you could possibly say, because then that's all the young person will want to do. I mean, why didn't Johannes say something else, like, it's a broom closet? Why, you want to see a broom closet? Or it's a fake door, silly, for decoration. Or even, it's the ladies' bathroom, your majesty, best not go poking your head in there. Any of those would have been perfectly sufficient, as far as I could tell. But he didn't say any of those things. If he had, none of the horrible, bloody events to follow would have ever happened. Well, in that case, guess I'm glad he didn't tell the truth. "Cost me my life!" the young king proclaimed with a toss of his head. Nonsense. He insisted he be let into the room. First he demanded, but Johannes refused. Then he commanded. Still Johannes refused. Then he threw himself on the floor and had a fit, which was very unbecoming for a young man the king's age. And finally, faithful Johannes realized that there was little he could do. So, wrinkling his old, malformed face into a wince, he unlocked and opened the door. The prince burst into the room. He found himself staring face to face with the most beautiful portrait of the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his life. Her hair looked like it was spun from pure gold thread. Her eyes flashed like the ocean on a sunny day. And yet, around her lips, there was a hint of sadness, of loneliness. The young king took one look at her and fainted dead away. Later in his room, he came to Johannes, hovered over his bed. "Who was that radiant creature?" the king asked. "That, your majesty, is the golden princess," Johannes answered. "She is the most beautiful woman in the world," the young king said. And Johannes answered, "Yes, she is." "And yet she looked almost sad. Why is that?" Johannes took a deep breath and replied, "Because, young king, she is cursed. Every time she has tried to marry, her husband has died, and it is said that a fate worse than death is destined for her children, if she should ever have any. She lives in a black marble palace, topped with a golden roof, all by herself, and, as you can imagine, she is terribly lonely and terribly sad." The king sat straight up in his bed and grabbed the front of faithful Johannes' tunic, and though he stared into the old man's face, he saw only the princess's bright ocean eyes, and her lips brimmed with sadness. "I must have her," he said. "I will marry her. I will save her." "You may not survive," Johannes said. "I will survive if you help me, if you are faithful to me, if you understand me. You'll do it." Johannes feared for the young king's life. He had understood the young king's father, and his father's father, and his father's father before that. What could he say? Johannes sighed. "I'll do it." It was widely known that in all the golden princess's days of loneliness, the only thing that gave her any modicum of happiness was gold. So Johannes told the king to gather all the gold in the kingdom and to command his goldsmiths to craft the most exquisite golden objects that the world had ever seen, which soon was done. Then Johannes disguised himself and the king as merchants and loaded a ship with the golden goods, and they set off for the land of the Golden Princess. As their ship's prow split the sea, Johannes tutored the king in his part. "You are a gold merchant, your majesty. The princess has always loved gold, but these days it is the only thing that gives her any joy. So when I bring her into the ship, charm her not only with your gentle manners and fine looks, but also with the gold. Then perhaps she will be yours." When they landed, the king readied the ship and tended to his merchant costume, while Johannes, carrying a few golden objects in his bag, made his way to the towering ramparts of black marble where the princess lived. He encountered the courtyard, and there discovered a serving girl retrieving water from a well with a golden bucket. "Pretty maid," he said, smiling his kind but unhandsome smile, "do you think your lady might be interested in such trifling works of gold as these?" And he produced two of the most finest, most exquisite golden statuettes that man's hand had ever made. The girl was stunned by their beauty. She took them from Johannes and hurried within. Not 10 minutes had elapsed before the golden princess herself emerged from the castle, holding the statuettes in her hand. She was as gorgeous as her portrait, more so in fact, and as she greeted Johannes, her golden hair flashed in the light and her ocean blue eyes danced with pleasure. Still around her lips there was sadness. "Tell me, old man," she said, "are these really for sale? I've never seen anything so beautiful, so fine." Faithful Johannes bowed. "But there is more, fair princess, much more. My master's ship is full of such wonders, and they could be yours if you would just accompany me down to the harbor." The princess hesitated for a moment. Since her last husband-to-be had died, she had not set foot outside the palace. But the allure of gold was too strong. She threw a shining travel cloak over her shoulders and followed Johannes to the boat. The young king, in his disguise as a merchant, greeted her. Her beauty was so stunning, her sadness so apparent and so tender that he nearly fainted again. But somehow he did not, and she smiled at him and invited him to show her all the treasures that he had brought to her fair land. As soon as they descended below the deck, Johannes hurried to the captain of the ship and in whispered tones instructed him to cast off from shore and set sail for home immediately. Now, my young readers, I know just what you're thinking. You're thinking, stealing a girl. That's an interesting way of winning her heart. Allow me to warn you now that under any other circumstances, stealing a girl is about the worst way of winning her heart you could possibly cook up. But because this happened long ago in a faraway land, seems to have worked. For the Golden Princess came back up to the deck, saw that her land was far away from her. At first, she did indeed protest, and fiercely, too, that she'd been carried away by low-born merchants. But when one of the merchants revealed himself to be a king, and revealed that, in addition, he was madly in love with her, and when, besides, Johannes assured her that if she really wanted to, she could go home, but she couldn't take the gold if she did, the princess realized that, in fact, the young king was just the kind of man she would like to marry after all, and decided that she'd give the whole matrimony thing one last shot. And they all lived happily ever after. The end. Are there any small children in the room? If so, it would be best if we just let them think that really is the end of the story and hurried them off to bed. Because this is where things start to get, well, awesome. But in a horrible, bloody kind of way. As the ship plowed through the purple sea, the new lovers made moon faces at each other near the bow. Faithful Johannes was sitting near the back of the ship, admiring the success of his plan when he noticed 3 ravens alight on a mast beam. The first raven motioned with his beak at the king and princess. "What a lovely couple those two make," he said. And the second said, "Yes, too bad they won't stay that way." The first said, "Oh, what do you mean?" "Well," the second replied, "when the ship gets to land, a beautiful chestnut stallion will canter up to the group, and the king will decide to ride it back to the castle. But if he does, he will be thrown from its back and die." "Good God, that's horrible," said the first raven. "Is there nothing anyone can do?" "Oh, there is," said the second raven. "Someone could kill the horse before the king mounts it, but what good is that? For if someone did it and told why he did it, he would be turned to stone from the tips of his toes to the knobs of his knees." "To stone?" said the first raven. "To stone," said the second. The third raven, who had been listening quietly, cut in at this point. "Oh, it gets worse, you know," he said. "If by some chance the two lovers escape that danger, another lies ahead. For when they arrive at the gates of the castle, a beautiful bridal gown made of pure gold will be laid out on a bed of purple flowers. The princess will want to wear it, of course, but if she touches it, she would be consumed by a ball of fire and burned to a cinder right there on the spot." "Good God, that's terrible!" cried the first raven. "Is there nothing anyone can do?" "Oh, there is," said the third raven. "If someone were to pick up the dress before she could and throw it in the fire, the princess would live. But what good is that? For if someone did it and told why he did it, he'd be turned to stone from the knobs of his knees to the core of his heart." "To stone?" repeated the first raven. "To stone," confirmed the third. "Nor is that all," said the second raven morosely. "For if the two lovers avoid that tragedy, a final one awaits. When they are married and begin the wedding dance, the new queen will swoon and fall to the floor and die." "Good God! That's the worst thing yet!" cried the first raven. "Is there nothing anyone can do?" "Oh, there is," said the third. "If someone were to bite the new queen's lip and suck 3 drops of blood from it, with his mouth, she would live. But what good is that? For if someone did it and told why he did it, he would be turned to stone from the core of his heart to the top of his head." "To stone?" said the first. "To stone," replied the second. "To stone," echoed the third. And with that, the 3 ravens shook their black beaks, sighed sadly, and flew away. Faithful Johannes buried his head in his hands, for he had heard all. He knew what he would have to do, and that it could not come to good. Just as the ravens had foretold, after the ship landed, and the king and his wife-to-be had been greeted by all the servants and courtiers of the castle, a beautiful chestnut stallion cantered up to the group. The king, taken with the beast's beauty, announced that it would bear him in triumph back to the castle. But before he could mount it, Johannes slipped onto its back, drew a blade, and cut the horse's throat, soaking its silken coat with warm red blood. It collapsed to the ground in a heap. Cries of shock went up from the crowd. The other servants, who had never loved misshapen old Johannes, whispered, "To kill the king's new stallion. Treason, treason." The king looked back and forth between Johannes and the dead horse. Johannes' face had no expression. At last the young king said, "Johannes was faithful to my father and to my father's father and to my father's father's father before that. He has always understood us, so I will understand him. If he does it, it must be right." Not another word was said about the subject, and the party proceeded afoot back to the palace. When they arrived at the gate, they saw a beautiful golden bridal gown lying on a bed of purple roses. "Oh, I shall wear it to the wedding," the queen-to-be exclaimed, running to take hold of the marvelous garment. But before she could reach it, Johannes grabbed it from the flower bed and strode into the great hall, where he threw it into the fire. Again, the party was taken with cries of shock and dismay. The servants huddled together and whispered, "Treason, treason." But the king hushed them. "Johannes has always been faithful to me and my family, so I will be faithful to him. If he does it, it must be right." The young king and golden princess were married the very next day. The princess looked particularly beautiful, her ocean blue eyes brimming with joy, but Johannes watched nervously. They moved to dance, and the music began. But they had not taken 2 steps when the new queen suddenly swooned and fell to the ground. Before anyone else could move, Johannes swept in, lifted her to his chest, and carried her out into the hall. He hurried through empty hallways, carrying the new queen in his arms to a narrow, winding staircase that led to the highest turret in the castle, his private chamber. When they arrived, he placed her carefully on the floor, bent over her with his 2 rotten teeth, bit her lip until he drew blood, and then, ever so tenderly, the unhandsome man sucked 3 drops of blood from her lips with his mouth. The queen began to stir. But just then the king burst into his room. He had followed Johannes all through the palace and had watched at a crack in the door at Johannes. His once faithful Johannes had done something unspeakable to his new queen. "Treason!" he bellowed at the top of his lungs. "Treason!" The other servants quickly ran to their king's aid. "King," Johannes said, "please trust me." "Take him to the dungeon," the young king shouted. "Tomorrow he dies." The next day, Johannes was led from the dungeon to the top of the funeral pyre. There he was tied as a torch was readied to set the great stack of hay and tinder on fire. The king watched with his new queen at his side. She had fully recovered from the day before, but both wore black and their faces were somber. "He was like a father to me," the young king said. The queen took his hand. The executioner lit his torch and brought it to the pyre, its sparks leaping eagerly at the dry tinder. Behind the king, the jealous servants muttered and smiled to one another. But just before the executioner could set the pyre alight, Johannes called out, "King, to whom I've been faithful, and to whose father and father's father and father's father's father I was faithful before, will you allow me to speak before I die?" The young king sadly inclined his head and said, "Speak." And so Johannes spoke. He told of seeing the 3 ravens on the ship. He told of hearing them speak. He told of their prophecy of the chestnut stallion. And as he told it, he turned to stone from the tips of his toes to the knobs of his knees. All the spectators gasped. But Johannes went on. He told of the raven's prophecy of the bridal gown. And as he did, he turned to stone from the knobs of his knees to the core of his heart. In the crowd, mouths fell open. Finally, he told of the raven's prophecy of the wedding dance. And when he turned to stone from the core of his heart to the top of his head, and he died. A great wail went up from all assembled, for they had learned too late that Johannes had been faithful to the very end and had given his life for his king. The king and the queen, in an effort to honor his memory, took faithful Johannes, grotesque even in stone, and placed him beside their bed so that every morning when they woke up and every evening when they lay down, they would be reminded of his faithfulness and the great debt they owed him. The end. Well, not really. More like the beginning. For it is here that the tale of Hansel and Gretel truly begins. But, I've been reading for a while, so I'm going to put this away, and I'll pick it up again another day.